Hubard's Cave in Colorado was home to one of the most bizarre cave rescues of all time. Two families pleaded for help after two adults disappeared without a trace. Law enforcement made the unprecedented move to block rescuers from entering Hubard's Cave for days. Later, rescuers were allowed inside, and then a fight erupted after the rescue, which sparked another investigation. The families accused the police with failing to comply with procedures, and the investigators claimed the lost cavers staged their own disappearance. Did rescuers make it in time to save the two lost cavers? Which side was right? Join us as we uncover the mysteries of the Hubard's Cave rescue. Hubard's Cave was named after settler William Hubard when he and his brother-in-law Griff Jones uncovered the cave during their journey for gold in 1892. Originally, they only found a pile of boulders, but as they broke them apart, the tumbling rubble revealed a cave entrance. Hubard and Jones searched for a better entrance, and they found an opening they could easily explore without laboring against tons of rock. Inside, the pair found campfires left by native Ute tribes. The Ute have a tradition known as the Bear Dance, which is a 10-day celebration held in March. In the past, they raced horses, gambled, and ate before and after the main event. In reverence to the bears they hunted, the Ute people gathered to dance like a bear scratching a tree, while musicians played instruments called rasps or notched sticks that mimic the sound of claws on bark. Afterward, the designated storyteller would weave interesting and allegorical tales around a campfire. Hubard and Jones even noted that there was evidence of bears living in the cave as well. The prospectors were enchanted by the cave. They kept walking deeper as each new step revealed new cave formations and crystals they had never seen before. Eventually, they realized they were lost. In their panic, they wound their way through the labyrinth of the cave, which only worsened their situation. They nearly resigned to their fate when their hunting dog trotted into their lamplight and led them back to the surface. Today, Hubard's Cave is located on the edge of the Glenwood Canyon on a rolling, rocky hillside dotted with pine trees overlooking the Colorado River. Another entrance was later found, giving the cave 3 different paths, and Hubard's houses one of the largest bat populations in Colorado. For over a century since its rediscovery, Hubard's remained open to the public, and it was a popular attraction for cavers, hikers, and partiers. Back in 2003, 54-year-old John Hayter and 49-year-old Sherry DeCrow drove into the Colorado wilderness to start their expedition into the countryside. They stopped at a trailhead parking space and started again down a long trail meant for bicycles and ATVs, though some brave hikers choose to walk the whole 9-mile trail along this route just to reach the actual trail that leads to Hubard's. The long trail leads to a secretive quarter-mile trail marked by an outdated and unkempt sign. The last stretch is steep and rocky, which makes the journey even more challenging. John and Sherry were fit, but the hike drained them more than they realized. Their fatigue would come back to bite them, limiting their mobility and strength in the cave and causing them to make poor choices that led to disaster. The main entrance to Hubard's is a triangular hole in the streaked rock that protrudes from the ground. The floor of the entrance is lined with sharp, jagged stones that have splinted from the cliffside or the ceilings of the cave. The ceiling dips down to resemble a dark, gaping maw ready to devour all those who dare to enter. Sherry only planned to show John the way to Hubard's Cave, but once they reached the cold and curious void in the rock, they threw caution to the wind and ventured into the darkness. Just like Hubard and Jones before them, the ambitious pair entered the cave, oblivious to the dangers that lay in wait below them. After their long trek, they had an easy start to the cave. Over the years, the government installed some steps, a metal tube, a support wall, and a ladder at the entrance because so many non-cavers ventured to the site. John and Sherry fit among those casual cavers who don't take splunking seriously. They brought flashlights instead of headlamps. They had no backup lights. They wore regular athletic hiking gear, and they had no food or water. On top of all these mistakes, they then started their journey by ignoring one of the most important steps for any cave adventure. They didn't tell anyone they were going into Hubard's Cave. Communicating the plan to others is a crucial step for anyone who wants to explore the deep tunnels below our feet. Once inside a cave, cell phones won't work. If you get stuck, injured, or lost, you're stuck relying on a chance encounter with another cave group or you're dead. John and Sherry overestimated their abilities and thought that Hubbard's would be safe, since it was such a popular attraction. Venturing into the cave, they found the same formations that bewildered William Hubbard when he explored the cave. There were selenite needles that jabbed from the walls like strands of glass, cave hair formed by gypsum oozing out of small pores in the rock to make curly hairs or long strands of silky-looking rope, and they found many more otherworldly sights as they hiked deeper below. The pair twisted around the bends of the cave without realizing Hubbard's contains 3 major passages. Nearly 400 feet into the cave, they noticed one of their lights was flickering. They shook the flashlight and jostled the electronics around a bit like you would with an old remote. Maybe the batteries were dislodged, or there was something stuck in the contacts that jammed up the electrical current. The device looked fine, but it was pretty old. Most people have flashlights for convenience, not for emergencies. Flashlights are rarely replaced, and few people fork out the money for a quality device. One of them realized how old the flashlight was after noticing the once clear plastic was slightly yellow from sunlight exposure. Then, the flashlight completely turned off. For once on this unfortunate adventure, they made the right call and turned around to go back to the safety of the forest above. As they walked through the narrow archways and over slippery ground, the other would-be caver nervously laughed and mentioned their flashlight was also old. They said they'd buy a new one later and offered to go shopping together. But roughly halfway back, they realized their light was dimming. Then, a familiar sight made their hearts sink and their stomachs turn. Their last remaining torch began to flicker. With one last flare, their only remaining light source was extinguished. Once more, they made a sound decision to remain stationary and pray for help. When Sherry didn't return home that night, no one seemed to notice. She was an adult, and she could come and go as she pleased. But 2 days after the pair went missing, her family, the DeCrows, tried to contact her. They only got her voicemail. They tried her home, but she wasn't there either. Sherry's daughter, Ramia, convened with the rest of the family to discuss her mother's absence. Some thought she might have skipped town to marry her friend John, but others were afraid something terrible had happened to her. That night, they submitted a missing persons report to the Garfield County Sheriff's Department. Now, some members of her family thought her ex-husband could be to blame, so the police investigated him. The family suggested her ex was violent, and fear quickly spread about what he could have done to her. Of course, her ex-husband was a dead end, and he had alibis for the night of her disappearance. Knowing that Sherry would sometimes explore the outdoors, the Air National Guard ran a helicopter sweep of the river and other water sources to search for her body. This search turned up no results, and it also failed to find their vehicle, which was still parked at the trailhead. That's when the DeCrows started to butt heads with the police. They thought the investigators didn't do a thorough job, so they recruited a family friend to fly his personal plane and search for any signs of Sherry. After only 30 minutes in the air, this independent pilot found her Suburban parked at the trail in the Colorado wilderness. This spot and its connection to Hubbard's has been popular for over 100 years. The family immediately knew what happened, but they couldn't convince the police. In their eyes, deputies and others involved in the search should have immediately connected the dots that Sherry could have been inside Hubbard's cave. But instead of calling a rescue team, they taped off the parking lot as a possible crime scene. After far too long, days after Sherry and John got lost, a canine unit led police to Hubbard's cave. Reports suggest that the police had no idea how to proceed. They called for Sherry down the cold stone steps of the cave and shined their lights into the darkness, but they didn't venture inside. To make matters worse, they still didn't call a cave rescue team. Sherry's son and daughter said they would search the cave themselves and recruit cavers to guide them to find their mother. The chances of finding her alive continued to plummet every second. They knew she was inside and they needed to act immediately, but the police refused to grant entry into Hubbard's because of the already debunked fears about her ex and the possibility of foul play which could endanger the lives of anyone entering the cave. Since it was considered a crime scene, they wouldn't allow anyone to potentially tamper with evidence, even though they could have escorted the rescuers to ensure they complied with procedures. The two camps argued until a thunderstorm rolled over the mountains and valleys of the area and the police disbanded the search party. Inside the cave, John and Sherry were struggling. The cold was numbing their rattling fingers, and the darkness was messing with their heads. At first, they thought about what they would do when they got out, but by the third day, they were crushed by hopelessness. Temperatures in Hubard's cave dropped to as low as 3 degrees above freezing. Then, as the storm came through, rain started to trickle down overhead and little streams snaked over their shoes. They didn't see the water coming in the absolute darkness of the cave, and now they had to face the cold with wet clothes. But at least these muddy drops of water could keep them alive, for now. Like her family, Sherry even wondered if her vindictive husband could be to blame for their misfortune. John also had an angry ex. Did their divorced partners collude to sabotage their batteries on purpose? The thought struck fear into them. What if their exes were waiting outside? And what were they planning to do with them? Beyond fear and the cold, the pair also faced other challenges inside the tunnels. Hubard's cave is at an elevation of 8,400 feet. Outside, the air is thinner and oxygen content is lower. It takes travelers days or weeks to adjust to the dry and thin atmosphere. They were used to it, but the body can only handle so much, and the oxygen inside the cave was even lower. They sat stationary, sucking all the fresh air from their surroundings. On top of all their other problems, the pair was slowly being poisoned by their own stagnant breath. By day 4, John was in bad shape. The two couldn't see how ragged they looked in the pitch blackness of the cave, but John's starvation and slow asphyxiation were becoming unbearable. If help didn't arrive soon, Hubbard's cave would become John's tomb. The thunderstorm battered the land for what felt like an eternity. The whole time, the DeCrows battled against the police to return and perform a rescue operation. Finally, after 4.5 days of Sherry's disappearance, police let the family and their team enter the cave. Of course, the police, who delayed the rescue for almost a week, sat outside. Even as the police watched people who had no idea how to properly explore caves enter the dark reaches of Hubbard's, they still didn't call an official rescue squad to aid them. The brave DeCrows weren't official rescuers. They had no gear. They lacked all the training cave rescuers dedicate their lives to learning and perfecting. But that day, they became rescuers. Armed with only crude flashlights and determination to find their missing family members, the team located Sherry and John only minutes after entering the cave. Because the group found Sherry so easily after entering the cave, that proved to the DeCrows that the police didn't even try to find her. After being gaslit for almost a week, the tension escalated into a fight between the police and the DeCrows. Allegedly, a detective choked one of the volunteers who joined the DeCrows to find the lost cavers. People on both sides held back the more aggressive members of each group, and eventually the threat of charges simmered the upset family members while John and Sherry were evaluated by medics. They were both exhausted and dehydrated. Their families explained the situation from their perspectives, which disgusted the fearful and shivering cavers. The medics noted they were weak and dehydrated, but they gave Sherry and John the choice to get hospitalized or return home. After seeing the fervor of their families, they opted to go home with them instead of traveling with emergency personnel. Home was a long way off, so the group stopped at a hotel to recover from the harrowing incident. It was later revealed that the sheriff never alerted local media outlets about Sherry's disappearance. The sheriff denied the cave rescue because he thought it could be a crime scene. But if that's the case, then why did he ignore a major component of a missing person's case? If he had given the public info on her car, it's likely that cavers or hikers would have found her Suburban the very next day after they went missing. The allegations of a detective choking a volunteer rescue were investigated by the Colorado Bureau of Investigations, and word spread throughout the nearby towns. Further adding fuel to the fire, the police insinuated that John and Sherry staged their rescue, despite the visible and medical evidence that they were battered and succumbing to exposure. The sheriff based his claim off of the inconclusive missing persons search, which involved members of the FBI. Sources indicate the team never properly explored the cave, which invalidates the validity of the search. His claim also relies on the medical evaluation that said the pair were fine, but the evidence seems to suggest the sheriff simply misunderstood the medic's evaluation. The medics have an obligation to prevent medical deterioration, but if John and Sherry got fluids, food, and rest, they should be fine. After seeing the tension between both groups, the medics could have made the call out of pity for Sherry and John. If they were sent to the hospital, they would be subjected to interviews from the police, which would only make them more upset. However, on the other hand, if Sherry and John got worse after leaving, the medics would be responsible for their condition. The medics would also be putting their necks on the line to lie to police. But from the reports, it seems like that the cavers and the police could have made mistakes, so it's also possible the medics dropped the ball as well. And in what seems like one final admission of incompetence, the sheriff said he knew the contact information of multiple Colorado cave rescue teams and the procedures for cave rescues, but in spite of the dogs leading them straight to Hubard's, the sheriff claimed that he had, and I'm quoting, "no reason to presume John and Sherry were lost in a cave," end quote. The sheriff also said he still believed in his method and that he'd do it the same way again. Both the cavers and the sheriff highlight how ignorance can easily become the death of anyone daring to explore underground caves. If John and Sherry knew the dangers and prepared accordingly, they probably would have been fine. And if the sheriff really understood cave rescues, his decisions could have been different, and the pair could have been saved much faster. But, as the DeCrows and the volunteers showed, you don't have to be a professional to be a hero when it counts. The Hubbard's cave story is a wild oddity in the world of cave rescues. What do you think? Is there ever a good reason to avoid calling rescuers? Would you be brave enough to put it all on the line and go inside the dark mazes below ground? Tell us your thoughts in the comments section. Click that like button if you're glad to know that Sherry and John made it out safely, and subscribe to the channel for more bizarre stories. New Mexico's Boy Scout Troop 108 entered Fort Stanton Cave on a warm morning in June 2003. The cave was challenging, but the first few hours of the trip went smoothly, until the troop took a wrong turn. They didn't realize the route had changed until it was too late. The new route was too difficult, and in their haste to exit the cave, 14-year-old Riley Walker slipped. Rescuers from across the state joined forces to get him out of the cave, but would they get there in time to save him from his gruesome injuries? Find out as we explore the Fort Stanton Cave Rescue. Fort Stanton Cave is located near the Sacramento Mountains beneath the Snowy River Cave National Conservation Area. This park was created back in 2009 to preserve the karst formations of the cave system below ground. In 1855, a group of soldiers found the cave and named it after the nearby military base that was created to defend settlers who were part of the Manifest Destiny movement, which sparked an influx of travelers moving to the West Coast along paths like the Oregon Trail. Fort Stanton Cave is a monstrous cave. In 2019, a team of professionals found 6 miles of new passages deep underground. And just last year, 2 more miles of the cave were surveyed, which makes the cave an astonishing 44.3 miles long. The Fort Stanton Cave System contains the largest continuous cave formation in the world, the white calcite layer formed on the riverbed of the Snowy River Passage. Despite having a world record, the cave still has more secrets for splunkers to uncover. Cavers still haven't reached a terminal point of the cave. Without an end in sight, cavers from all over the world continue to run scientific expeditions to uncover what lies in the shadows of Fort Stanton Cave. The cave's unique history and challenging interior made it the perfect place for the Boy Scouts to test their mettle. The team entered the first gate at Fort Stanton and were immediately faced with some choices. The scout leaders already mapped their journey, but the team could go into hellhole number 2, they could go down the winding Bat Cave, left into the hell of 1,000 pinches, or forward into the deeper cave. They ignored these side passages and passed by Russell's Crawl as well as they entered the main corridor. The first miles of the cave have low-hanging ceilings, forcing the team of novice cavers to crawl on their hands and knees or on their stomachs through tight claustrophobic tunnels. Traversing around rough corners, the team braced themselves for upcoming steep, muddy slopes that could easily cause a fall. The kids with lighter body weights could almost slide down the slopes without much trouble, but the adults had to balance their weight to avoid straining their ankles. They reached Devil's Backbone, an area with large boulders they had to navigate around and over top of to continue onward. After another bend, they reached 20 steps, which splits into another junction. One route takes them through the Big Bend to a loop that leads further into the cave's miles-long maze. The other direction is the more common route, and the route Troop 108 chose to take. Through the Crystal Crawl, the boys met another triangular room. One way led to a large hall, and the other led to the Decoration Passage. The Decoration Passage opened into larger tunnels filled with beautiful karst formations. The group marveled at the cave's wonders and pushed forward to the Rose Bowl room and into a large, collapsed chamber. This breakdown passage connected to the lake room up above, and by maneuvering through the rubble, the team reached the lower breakdown passage to continue their journey. This breakdown passage connected to the lake room up above, and by maneuvering through the rubble, the team reached the lower breakdown passage to continue their journey. This area required some tricky maneuvering down wet rocks and through narrow squeezes with sharp edges. Thankfully, the boys were small enough to fit through the constricted tunnels without much trouble. Next, they encountered the Keyhole Gate. Park officials imply that they added multiple gates at different distances to prevent cavers from wandering down unexplored passages, though some have speculated these barred passages lead to secretive compounds used by the military fort above ground. After all, the first nuclear detonation in history was the Trinity test conducted at New Mexico's own Alamogordo Range. And following the 1963 Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, all nuclear tests had to be conducted underground to limit the spread of radioactive dust through the air. The boys didn't know about these dark conspiracies, so they kept exploring, none the wiser. The scouts climbed past the Keyhole Gate and the Platter Room into yet another large chamber with stunning rooms extending from all directions. From the Hall of Velvet, the troop could access some of Fort Stanton's most famous formations, including the Sand Passage, the Gypsum Hall, and the Helictite Hall. They made it to this area in the early afternoon. After taking notes and quizzing each other on the crystals and strange formations in the cave, the team turned around to head home. But that's when their happy adventure turned into a hellish nightmare. Just past the Keyhole Gate and the three-way hill room, the team took the wrong path. Instead of walking through the trophy room into the lower breakdown passage, they took a right and went into Satan's shoe fly and the hellhole. The hellhole is a 1,700-foot-long narrow passage that can easily trap unskilled adult cavers. The adults realized they took a wrong turn because nothing in the cave had been this difficult, but they continued pushing forward. This passage had tight crawls that exit into steep drops with mud at the bottom, essentially death traps for any unskilled cavers, and nearly everyone here was unskilled. 14-year-old Riley Walker was slowly climbing down one of the tunnels in the hellhole when his foot slipped. Parts of the passage were so tight, people could let go, and the walls of the cave would pin them in place. In order to progress, they'd have to push themselves down. But here, the tunnel opened up just enough to let him slide straight down. He wasn't even close to the bottom. Riley bounced around the side of the rocky tube and fell 20 feet straight down. The scout troop was well prepared for the journey, and Walker was decked out in all the right gear to tackle the cave's difficult challenges. But knee and elbow pads wouldn't save him from this fall. The thick padding of his clothes couldn't stop the rocks from slicing his skin as he fell through the tunnel. After crashing to the floor, his fellow scouts and the leaders rushed to him. His nose was smashed, his ankle was twisted, he had cuts on his face, hands, and up his arms, and his leg had a huge gash. His friends reeled at the sight. They could see the fibers of his muscles frayed beneath his skin, and blood so red it looked black as it flowed from the wound. Half the team split to go back down Satan's shoe fly and out through the way they came. They'd get help while the rest of the team stayed with Walker. The team with Walker quickly tried to constrict his leg by wrapping clothing around his thigh. This would hopefully slow the bleeding, but it could damage his nerves, and it wasn't guaranteed to save him. The rest of the team found a gate and reached the surface. The park team gave the scouts a paper with contact info in case of an emergency. If the team called the police, the dispatch would have to call cave rescue teams. Calling these numbers would cut out the middleman. After calling multiple numbers, local first responders arrived at Fort Stanton's entrance below the nearby road. Police, firefighters, and paramedics all arrived along with volunteers from a local caving club that knew Fort Stanton like the back of their hands. Roughly 2 hours after the accident, the first rescuers reached Walker. But the rescue was far from over. He was lying on the cold, hard surface of the cave around 2 miles from the entrance. The rescuers thought he was in the easy passages. Getting him out through the hellhole would be difficult. The first rescuers split up. Some stayed to wait for medics to arrive, and others left Walker to contact state agencies and the Southwestern Regional Coordinator to initiate a full-scale rescue. The coordinator was now in charge of saving Walker's life. He called multiple cave rescue teams all across New Mexico. People left their jobs and ran to their cars to speed across the highway and rescue the fallen scout. An hour after Walker was located, the medics reached him. They gave him painkillers and cut away the ripped cloth that was stuck to his open wounds. They cleaned the cuts with antibiotics and rubbing alcohol and tried to stop the bleeding by applying a tourniquet. Outside, the coordinator split the rescuers into teams. One team would bring equipment and supplies into the cave to aid the medics, give food to the rescuers, and provide the rescuers with anchors and ropes needed for the extraction. Another team was tasked with laying telephone wires so that the team could communicate using rugged, military-grade field phones. The third team would actually rig the lines needed to bring Walker out of the cave, since he couldn't walk with his injuries. Each team contained 6 caving experts, and after 3 hours of work, 3 more teams were added to the mix. Over 50 rescuers came to save the Boy Scout from Fort Stanton Cave. There was no flood or breakdown yet, but the rescuers were still racing against time to save Walker. His blood loss could easily lead to permanent injuries, or even death. New Mexico has a hot, dry climate, but the tunnels below ground can get extremely cold. Temperatures in Fort Stanton Cave average around the lower 50s. That might not sound too bad. Walking outside for a few minutes in that weather is no problem for most people, but hours of unrelenting exposure wears down even the toughest spirits. Plus, the human body doesn't have to be below freezing for it to freeze to death. Although the rescue was a textbook example of what rescuers needed to do in these high-pressure situations, they were still taking way too long to save him. A little after midnight, the crew had rigged enough line to attempt the next step of the rescue. They had to get Walker out of the hellhole. Rescuers wrapped Walker in a rugged stretcher with solid backs and sides so that the rocks wouldn't cut into him as the stretcher slid along the jagged floor. Rescuers started pulling the ropes, and Walker's stretcher scraped along the narrow tunnels. Hours later, at 2 a.m., the stretcher emerged from the hellhole. The crews reapplied the pain meds and fixed his wounds again, but the rescue wasn't over yet. The rescuers attached the Boy Scout to new ropes and hooked their own harness to the stretcher. Rescuers lined the sides of the stretcher and held onto it for dear life. In unison, they each stood up with the stretcher and began walking him through the open tunnels of the cave. It took the team 5 more hours to reach the first gate, but by 7:30 a.m., 15 hours after the accident, Walker made it out of Fort Stanton Cave. He was loaded into an ambulance, and he later recovered from his injuries. Fort Stanton Cave is now closed to the public, and even novice cavers can't gain entry. If you found yourself lost deep below ground, miles from the exit, would you keep pushing forward, or would you turn around? How would you even know which way you were going? Tell us how you'd tackle these problems in the comments section. If you want to see more videos like this one, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more spine-tingling stories of life and death.